I don't know how, I think this is the 10th in our Grow Your Biz webinar series. And so we've covered all of April, and now we're halfway through May to introduce incredible speakers, presenters who have topics that are so relevant to our situation that we're all in as it relates to COVID-19. So Victoria is one of our Grow Your Biz, I should introduce myself. I'm Barbara Mowat, and I'm the president and founder of Grow Your Biz. And we have online today, we have Mark Hatchie in the red jacket, who is our managing director for Ontario, and again, a colleague of mine from the 1990s. And so I'm delighted to be able to work with her. We have Victoria, who is our chair for Toronto 4, and brand new chair, actually. We're very pleased to have you, Victoria. And Victoria is an executive coach on leadership and team development, and has been involved in IT as a computer scientist, entrepreneur, business leader, and she has developed high performance teams. Her current area of specialization is definitely doing high performance teams and helping them execute. She's got over 25 years of experience in software development and specialized in program and project management and architecture for large complex projects, which I did not know anything about that. You know that, Victoria? I'm learning more every day about you, and it's so delightful. Her previous corporate positions include a VP of engineering for Tier 1 CRM and Infobright Inc., which I know nothing about. So here I am. Love finding out more. And the senior director positions in prominent companies such as Bell Canada, RBC, and CIBC. So I can't think of a more wonderful person and influential person to talk about constructive negotiation. It's that thing that we call difficult conversations, which all of us often have and continue to have. So this week she's going to provide preparing for negotiation, establishing your best alternative to a negotiated agreement, clarifying the negotiation process, interest versus position, and settling on the win-win. So thank you, Victoria, for offering that to us today. And Alicia in the top left corner, oh, well, it depends on how you're looking at your screen, is my EA, and she will be keeping track of the chat box. So please make sure that you ask questions, and we will give time at the end. So Victoria will take the lead for about 50 minutes, and then the last 10 minutes we'll open it to questions. So as you hear something that you want clarification on, please list it and write it down in the chat box or save it for the end. Thank you, and over to you, Victoria.
Thank you, and thank you for the lovely introduction. Welcome, everyone. So before, I'm just going to set up my screen share here, so just a sec. I should have done this before. So one thing that would be helpful is if you have a chance, think about a negotiation you have, either one that you've done before, maybe didn't work out exactly the way you would like, or one you're about to enter into. And of course, in this day and age right now, I imagine there are a lot of people who are negotiating some sort of agreement. So if you could use that as an example, because we'll work with that as kind of like a case study. Can you see the presentation right now?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So we'll do that. I can't get it to advance. Oh, there we go. Okay. So have a case study ready to work with. We'll go through a little bit about what is a negotiation, what makes it hard, what kinds of approaches we use that don't actually work very well, And then, what are the steps that we need to take in order to prepare for a negotiation? What is a good way to structure a conversation when you're having a negotiation? And finally, what are some of the thoughts you should carry through with in terms of a commitment? Okay. I'm going to I'm hoping to make this kind of interactive. So at certain points, I would invite you to put either answers in a chat, or if you're willing to unmute and engage in a conversation about a negotiation, then we can sort of illustrate some of the points. And I think that would make it much more meaningful and hopefully a lot more fun. Okay?
Oh, great.
So far, so good. So the first part is, the thing is, there really aren't any difficult conversations. It's just that we don't really know how to approach them effectively. Okay, so what we need to do is figure out how to do it properly and to have confidence that you can succeed in going through that process. So in terms of a negotiation itself, or even a difficult conversation, there are 3 conditions that need to exist before it becomes really sort of problematic or something you need to negotiate. Okay. The first part is you need to have a different disagreement. So we need to have some sort of difference of opinion. So for example, let's say I'm negotiating or I would like to go on a trip with my daughter. Okay. And so if she says, well, what I'd really love to do is go to a beach somewhere, and my thought is I'd love to go skiing, we have a difference of opinion on how to spend our time, right? And what kind of, holiday we'd like to have together. The second part is scarcity. So there's some limitation. So maybe the limitation in this case of going for a trip is we have a limited amount of money, so we can't afford to go to both. There might be a limit in terms of time frame. So there's all sorts of different types of resources that might be scarce, which makes it a problem. The third part is disputed property rights. So, who's the person who makes the decision or has the right to make a decision? And often in a business scenario, it would be both parties need to agree in order to proceed on something. In the case of, going on a trip with my daughter, then it's a bit more, we both need to agree on a trip to be satisfying, right? So we both have a piece of the property rights, okay? So anything about that makes sense? One of the things you can think about is if you can remove one of these, then you don't really have an agreement. So for instance, if in the case of my daughter, if we both agree that we don't really need to go on vacation together, we don't want to share any of that sort of stuff, we can both go on our separate trips and be happy, and then there's no dispute to argue with. Okay? Any questions so far, or we're good to go? So, what happens when we don't really know how to have a conversation like this? So here's some of the classic scenarios. The first one is denial. So I kind of like this picture because it's kind of what people do. We kind of hide, we avoid it. We don't think about, we don't even sort of acknowledge that there is a problem or there's a conflict that needs to get addressed. And the longer this goes on, the more frustrated people become in the situation, because their issues are not really being addressed. A similar approach would be avoidance. So, I'm not really willing to have a conversation in a business setting. This is the guy who takes off and goes on holidays when there's a big critical decision to be made. They don't want to be part of the discussion. I guess, you're kind of hoping that maybe it'll just go away. Okay. Another scenario is surrender. I think this is maybe a bit more common for women. I don't really want to have the argument. I don't want to fight with you. I'll just live with the consequences. You decide, I'll step out of it. In the end, you're going to feel very dejected, like you're not really, like your concerns aren't really valid. So it's not a very good long-term strategy, particularly in a longer-term type relationship. The next scenario is domination. So I always think this is funny because I can think of many cases where, you know, you get into a negotiation with somebody and when they feel like they're not being heard, then they just yell at you louder, you know, in the hopes that you will capitulate and agree with them, right? You know, it's not really it may win you the argument, but it certainly doesn't get you any sort of long-term relationship. Like it destroys the relationship in the process, right? Another standard one in sort of a business scenario is to escalate. So if I can convince my boss, and she looks like quite a wonderful lady and quite understanding, I'm getting an echo sometimes. Oh, maybe it'll stop.
Is it going now?
Yeah. The thing about an escalation is if you know, in a business scenario, if you're both reporting to the same boss, then this might work, except that often what you do in an escalation is you only present the one side. So the person who's your boss is not really given the full story, and usually, you know, isn't that involved in the decision. So you may win the argument, but it doesn't really fester or create a good relationship, a good working relationship with your boss or your peers. The next alternative that we try to some extent, and I've done this a few times, is to try and have everyone vote, and we go with the majority. And my experience is that, you know, as soon as the meeting's over and the vote's taken, then everyone's around the water cooler complaining about they didn't get heard, their choices, you know, it was the wrong thing. The thing about the majority is if you have difficult decisions, the majority doesn't necessarily give you the best options. You know, and we do see that in the world in terms of, you know, voting, because we actually have people like Trump who, you know, win the vote, so to speak. Maybe not the best solution. The last one in the list of approaches that don't work that well is compromise. And so these were a few design items I thought were like a compromise of sorts. And as we know, we don't really get, we might find a good middle ground, but it's really not the best solution. And everyone loses in this case. Everyone feels like they've lost one piece of the, you know, of a potential solution, right? So it's really not that great. Anybody want to share anything about some of their strategies and how these ones don't particularly work? Oh, everyone's going to be quiet. Okay.
I'll just say sometimes, and maybe this is compromise, and I guess it depends whether it's a family situation or a business situation, and maybe both. It's sometimes I just have to, I've learned how to say the words, let's agree to disagree. And maybe that's the compromise.
Right.
But that to me is the way that I can sort of breathe at the end. Let's agree to disagree. I don't know if that's something you use a lot, but that's mine.
It's an interesting point in, you know, when at the beginning where you've got the 3 conditions. If there's no scarcity and there's no disputed property right, then you can agree to disagree and it doesn't matter.
I think it was relating more to, you mentioned the word Trump. So I'm going to say so many of my friends in the US, and I love my US friends.
Right.
But if we just have to agree not to talk politics, we just have to agree not to bring up certain subjects. And that happens also with family. disputes.
Mhm.
It's like, you know what? We're not ever going to agree on this.
Yes.
So let's just not talk about it. So it's not about, I mean, we all have our own self-worth that we want to take care of.
Right.
So it's whether that's denied. I mean, we avoid it. So it's agree to disagree. I
Yes.
still love you as a friend, but I also know that I remove myself from that friendship. So there isn't a good consequence in the long run unless you're really, really close. So that's just my take. I'd love to learn how to, how to convince them to go on my side.
Yes. I love what you're saying. It's a little different than a negotiation where you need to find an agreement at the end. It's more like if you think about, you know, we might be fans of certain, you know, hockey teams in Canada, or you know, and we could argue tooth and nail that which, you know, hockey team's better than the other. It really doesn't matter at the end of the day. And maybe just, you know, being curious about what, you know, how a person is thinking about it helps you maintain that relationship, as opposed to just trying to get them convinced that, I don't know, the Maple Leafs are the best, right?
I guess though it does affect that whole thing about having different viewpoints and that difficult conversation is that if it does affect business, because if that colleague, let's say from the world, and I know his or her views, I don't hire them. I don't want to buy from them.
Yes.
Right. So I'm just saying, I don't want to affiliate myself with them.
Yes.
So it's a loss for both of us in some ways, because I know they have great skills, but politically, or because of their views, it'll come up over and over again. So it's that internal belief. So that to me is so it does affect the bottom line. It is a business. So sometimes the personal feelings tie into business decisions.
Right.
And I don't know how to ever resolve that.
Yeah.
That's a difficult one. I understand. That's why I'm giving it to you.
Yes. And fair enough. Thank you for the challenge. My thought on that, or where my mind goes, is that you have very different, like those opinions are tied into your values, and you have a difference of values. And if you're negotiating a long-term contract with another organization, you want to make sure that your values are aligned.
I think that's correct. And that was Vanya's session yesterday about purpose and core values, and take a look at that. But then I also think maybe I'm too dominating. So then your word domination came up for me, because I am very strong-willed, right? So just your words are great.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead. Sorry. Go for it.
No, I love your perspective there in terms of it is interesting because, you know, when you're negotiating deals with partners and you're going after a long-term partnership, and the values or underneath, or the purpose in the organizations, there needs to be some alignment there. You need to feel like you're supported, and it's a good, winning relationship for you.
Yeah.
And
well, it is. It's the bottom line where you're saying settling on the win to win. How do we get to that? So continue, Victoria. Good comments.
Okay. I'll carry on. So, why are these ineffective? The first thing you really need to think about is, when we enter into a negotiation, we often just have two sides, right? And when there's only two solutions, it almost forces our thinking into a win and a lose. Like, because either my solution wins or yours wins, and either way, somebody else loses. So that's, when you enter into a negotiation, it's better to broaden your perspective and try and come up with more options. The other thing about some of these situations, like the middle of a road, which would be like voting, or when you do a compromise, you wind up with almost everybody losing. nobody really gets a really wonderful solution for themselves. And what happens in organizations or over a long term is you're going to have a lot of resentment showing up because people don't really feel like they were heard or listened to. There's a lack of trust, particularly in the case where somebody's very dominating. It's like they don't, we can't really trust them. They're going to do whatever they're going to do. And it really discourages the engagement. So there's really a lot of negativity around using these other approaches. Although I think we all do it. I mean, I even see myself doing it. So it's common. So what do we need to do in order to have a more effective negotiation? The first part is to really think, is to change your thinking a little bit. So if you're focused really on a win-win solution, so what is, if you're going into a partnership with another organization, what's a great win for them and what's a great win for you, right? And what kind of learning can occur through the negotiation and through the partnership? Because the more you can learn from the other organizations, like you're part of kind of an ecosystem of other businesses. So how can you learn from them? How can you leverage that? And how can you make the partnership even more valuable? And through that shift in thinking, you will create more and more options. And the more complex, the more, I shouldn't say complex, but the more options you have, the more sort of levers you can play with, the better the solution is that you're going to come up with. I see Mark nodding, so I'm thinking Mark's done a lot of negotiating in her time. The next thing that we don't do well enough in most cases is to prepare. So you really need to take time to prepare and work your way through some questions. And as part of the this presentation, I put together a bit of a worksheet that you can download. It's just a Word document and it asks you some of these questions so you can start to sort of fill it out and help you prepare for a negotiation you might have, right? Some of the things you need to think about are, what are your real needs and desires? Because often what we do is we just come to a conclusion about what the solution is, and we don't really identify fully what are all of the criteria behind it. So to take as an example, if I go back to the planning a trip with my daughter, and I think about myself and what I love about going skiing, then, to be in the mountains, to be outside, to be in the fresh air, to have an adventure, to be active during during the vacation. These are all things that are important to me, and those are kind of my needs and desires. But it doesn't have to be skiing, right? Like I could be, climbing in the mountains or hiking or whatever. I have all sorts of options when I have those needs and desires kind of identified, right? So really being able to step back and realize what are your needs, what are you trying to achieve through the agreement. The next point is around your commitment to a mutually beneficial agreement. So I like to think of this as, am I going into the negotiation with my own agenda? As an example, if I go back to the situation of trying to negotiate a trip with my daughter, if I think should be doing more exercise and she needs to be more healthy, then I'm going to pick things that are on that side, right? And so I'm actually have my own agenda that I'm trying to achieve through this negotiation. So sometimes you have to be a bit careful about what, can I let go of those things so I can negotiate fairly? And am I trying to force something on somebody else, right? So really thinking about what would be a mutually beneficial agreement, looking at what you might learn from the other organization, how you might partner, how could you make it even better for both of them? What do you need, what about their business that you don't really understand that might help you work together better? So these are sort of the mutual learning that you can find. It's always good, on the next point, it's always good to, pick an environment, a time and a place to have the conversation. And spend some time to think about where you're going to get some neutral ground, what time of day even are people going to be relaxed to have a really successful negotiation. And the last point there is really just, the guys that do professional negotiations, they spend over 10 hours for any negotiation just preparing. So, it's well worth your time to invest in it. While you're thinking about, how to prepare for the negotiation, it's also a good idea to consider what your alternatives are if you don't successfully negotiate. So here it's like, what's the best alternative that I can come up with? That if I can't, so in my example of going for a trip with my daughter, if I can't come to an agreement with her in terms of the vacation, then I could say, well, I'm going to go skiing by myself. I can just go skiing. Who cares? She won't come. But then I'd be thinking, well, then I'm going to be alone. So maybe I get someone, find out about a ski group so I could go with some other people, or maybe I know some people in a ski group, in which case I could go with some people that I actually know, and each one of those, what I'm actually doing is improving what we call BATNA, your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And the more you can improve your alternative, the stronger the position you have when you go into a negotiation. So this is another quite important point to really think about before you go into the negotiation. It'll give you confidence, and it will also keep you from agreeing with things that are not even close to the minimum that you would need in terms of the agreement. Any questions about that? Anybody care to talk to me about BATNA and their BATNA? I guess everyone's going to be quiet. Any questions? Like, people get that? Sometimes people don't understand what a BATNA is, so. Okay. I will move on. Okay, some other things. These are little tips, tips and tricks from the pros. So one thing, many of us, when we go into one of these negotiations, are quite anxious. So if you can reframe that in terms of excitement, I'm really excited to get this deal together. We're going to have a really great negotiation. This will be a fun learning. Reframing it really helps to sort of make the conversation much more relaxed and less tense. Okay. The next point is actually kind of interesting. So when you enter in a negotiation and somebody puts an offer on the table, that is what's called an anchor. And psychologically, this comes from Daniel Kahneman. He wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. But when you put an anchor on the table, the reality is that the end agreement will not vary much from that anchor. So for instance, if let's say I'm selling a car, and I don't know, I'm going to pick on you, Barbara. Barbara wants to buy the car, and I say to Barbara right out of the get-go, I want 10 grand for it. And she's already done her looking around and shopped around, and she knows her BATNA is, I can get the same car for $8,000, right? So as soon as I say 10, you're not going to be willing to pay 10 because you know 8's the right deal. But what you should understand is, if you continue to negotiate with me, in all likelihood, you're going to be pretty close to the $10,000. So when you anchor an agreement with a draft agreement, you are basically saying to whoever you're negotiating with, this is kind of where I'm starting. And if they start negotiating there, you have some comfort to know that you're going to be close to that. What if you're on the other side? So let's say somebody presents me with an offer and it's outrageous. So going back to the car deal again. So maybe, you know, I'm thinking the car's worth about 8,000 and somebody presents, you know, 15 grand to me for this car. Then my best option is to say, I'm not going to negotiate. Because if I enter into the negotiation, I'm going to wind up somewhere close to that 15 grand. If I say that's not even close to acceptable, bring back an offer that it's much more reasonable and, you know, for the marketplace, then I will look at it. Then you don't get stuck in taking a really bad deal. So this anchoring the agreement, you can use it to your advantage, and it can work against you if, or I shouldn't say work against you, when someone presents an anchor, it can be not a good situation for you to continue with, and you might want to break off the negotiation. Any questions about that? Because it's kind of complicated.
Good one.
Yep, you're getting it? Okay, cool. The next one is around using the power of silence. It's really kind of funny when you're in a negotiation. If you, you know, if they are telling you something or making a point, stay silent with it and see what happens. And if they question you about it, you can always say, I'm just thinking about what you just said. So, you know, to give yourself that space. It gives you space. It allows you to calm down. But the other thing is quite often the other person feels so obliged to fill in the space, they'll tell you more. And the more you know, obviously, the more you've got to negotiate with. So that's another key thing to think about. Another kind of way to help view the negotiation as kind of this win-win is to really ask them for advice. So if you were in my situation, would you do this? How would you feel about this? Or what's your approach to this? All of these ways of asking for advice gets them more engaged and more committed into the conversation, and will reframe or turn their thinking from maybe this win-lose into a win-win arrangement, right? If you're in a really tough negotiation, you can consider putting the offer to a test and in binding arbitration. Binding arbitration basically means that an arbitrator chooses a solution and both parties have to live with it. When they use this a lot in cases where they're negotiating sports contracts, like for players and stuff like that, because both sides are very unreasonable, but they need to make a deal. So then when they sit separately, they write out what agreement they're willing to put forward, and they're much more fair when they realize that the arbitrator will pick one of them. So if you need to make it much more serious in terms of the negotiation and you need to get through it successfully, then this might be something you would consider. I think to me it would be a bit of a last option, but you know, I don't know. Really to focus on maximizing the success of both parties. Like, you know, is it a good deal for them? Do you feel like it's a good deal for them? If they, you know, in many, certainly in business scenarios, when you're negotiating a deal, you're going to be partners for a period of time. So if they're feeling like you just, you know, drag them through the coals, then they're not going to be very cooperative partners. So it's very important to think about, is it a good deal for them? If you were in their shoes, would you take the deal? And hopefully they would reciprocate in the same way. There have been a few cases where there was one in the worksheet, I provided some other resources you can take a look at, but there was a scenario they were talking about where a guy was quite a ruthless negotiator, and he negotiated a great deal for his company, but a real not very good deal for the other party. And after he slept on it, he phoned them back up and said, you know what, this was not a good deal for you guys. Let's start negotiating again. So really looking for that, maximizing the success is important. This is specifically for women. The thing about when women go into negotiation, and Barbara, you were sort of alluding to this a little bit, is when we show up as kind of tough and maybe quite clear on what we want in a negotiation, it works against the biases people have about women. We are supposed to be accommodating and nice and, you know, endearing and inclusive, and so it's too much of a contrast, and so people react poorly to it. So one of the things you can do in that scenario is to look for some way of framing your side in a cause. So it's not an argument about you personally or your selfish needs. It's an argument from more of a global clause. Like, Barbara, if I can use you as an example, you know, if you present the like a negotiation from the point of view of Grow Your Biz, you know, there's lots of women entrepreneurs out there. They provide really great businesses. You know, if I can successfully negotiate this with you, then wouldn't that be great for all of these women entrepreneurs that are really, you know, need help to really bring their businesses forward. You know, that would be a way of framing it in a cause. Is that helpful?
I'll give you a concrete example of something I experienced with David Suzuki and the oil industry.
Oh, cool.
And it was one where he was meeting with high level oil industry people, and it was one of the wives of the CEO was there, and he knew he knew he had to find common ground. So, and he knew he had the attention, not necessarily of the CEO. So he was directing it at the women around the table who were nodding yes. And his comment was, let's look at what we can all agree on. And it's covering some of the tips that you're mentioning here. Can we all agree that we want clean air to breathe? And the men were stoic, but the women were, yes, yes. Can we all agree that we want to have food that we grow that is not polluted from the ground? So we went on the things that we all agree on.
Right.
Right. So it was a wonderful way to kind of say, let's look at the common ground. And it was framing for, my point is that he was framing for a cause.
Right.
Then he did the other side, and he said, but how many in here are depending on, you know, they're in the industry where they're cutting down trees. What do? Do we take that away from them? Where would they make their living? So he was looking at it from a cause point of view to try to build the relationship, to try to make the audience understand, yes, I'm considered the green person, I'm considered this, but I see both sides.
Yeah.
That's my.
Yeah, cool. One of the other things there's a book called Getting to the Yes. I've forgotten who wrote it, but he also says to find a few things you can agree on helps sort of set a good platform to have a negotiation on. So that we're not seen as enemies, but we have stuff that we can agree on, kind of thing. The last point about long-term, short-term, I think when you were talking about David Suzuki and how he presented it, he is kind of talking about long-term. But psychologically, if someone's given a short-term choice and a long-term choice, they will usually take the short-term. So, you know, maybe not providing a short-term solution or framing it more in a longer-term kind of scenario gives you more options in terms of your negotiation. So that's another thing to consider. Okay, any questions about that? Then we'll go to the next one. Okay, so now we're going to go into how to have the conversation. Okay, so you've done your prep, you got your BATNA, you're ready to go, you found a nice quiet place. to have the conversation. So in terms of the process, it's good to clarify, how you would like to approach the conversation with the other person you're negotiating with. And so this process makes it easy to sort of walk through. The first part is to get B to understand A's position and interests. So A would state, what they're doing, and B would try and make sure that they understood it. And then you flip, so then you take turns. So at the end of the first couple of steps, you should understand each other's positions, right? The next part is then you go into kind of a brainstorming activity and try and figure out what are all the options, all the alternatives, crazy, whatever, put them all on the table, right? And then from there, you can come up with a mutually beneficial agreement. Excuse me. So then if we drop into the first part, because the first part is actually pretty critical in terms of your actual negotiation. You're getting it started on the right sort of place. So the first part is A would say their position. So if I use the example of my daughter going back to the trip, and let's say I am, she's presenting her position and I'm listening. So she says, she would come up with something like, well, I'd really like to go to the beach. And what I really want about that is it's got to be sunny and I would like it to be warm. And I might say, okay, so I hear that you would like it to be warm and sunny. And is there anything you'd like to do on the trip while you're there? Well, she says, maybe I'd like to explore. I'd like to have some adventure. Oh, so not only should it be sunny and warm, but you want to have more, you'd like to be able to explore maybe a new place, maybe an adventure, maybe hiking, et cetera, et cetera. And so we can go back and forth until we get clarity around what interests her about what, in terms of what she would like to do for the vacation. At the end of this, then it's good that if you're the listener, that you repeat all of the things you learned about A's position and make sure A agrees to it. Okay. And then you can flip. So if somebody would like to sort of engage in a conversation to sort of role play that, I think that would be helpful, but any takers? No.
You want me to play the part of your daughter?
Sure.
Okay, just.
Oh, you're on mute again.
Yeah, no, I'm off.
Okay.
Okay. So, hi. So I can be the daughter. So I need to present my position to you?
Yes. What would you like to do for your vacation? You could just
Okay, well, I'm kind of like your daughter's idea. Sitting on the beach with a cool drink, getting some sun, not too much, but I would like to explore the region too. But I like the warmth, so that's why I'm not looking forward to going skiing in the snow.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So what I heard.
Sorry, Victoria, I was going to ask, going back to your daughter, I think one of the questions that would be important for me to frame this is, who is going to pay for the trip? And then it goes into the question of, the power relationships between the two parties. It's often the case that, we don't have a conversation of equals. And how would you approach this when it's not the case? You may have a customer consulting or consulting firm or consultant relationship, or you may have to negotiate with your boss. And how would these things change or impact maybe your approach there?
That's a very good question. In the case of my daughter, we would have to figure out what the financial bit is. Hopefully you're equal, but usually in many relationships, there's a difference. I think you have to take some of that into consideration in your best alternative. I I think just sort of recognizing that you might not be in the same position. So to be open and honest about like the one that comes up for me is let's say I'm negotiating with a supplier of some sort, or I'm, you know, and they're way bigger than I am because I'm just a little small company, right? To make sure that they understand that position and that there may be certain needs that I would need to take care of that they wouldn't necessarily have to do for others, or it might be the other way around. The one that comes up for me would be if you've tried negotiating with somebody like Amazon, then they're very restrictive about what your alternatives are and what you can do in terms of an agreement. And you really don't have much of a choice as a small business. You either have to agree to it and accept it and live with it, or find a better alternative.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, I used to face situations like that where IBM are offering me a multi-million-dollar project, and they have very specific terms. So I have to decide if I want to accept their terms in order to get that project, to leverage it to other large organizations. So, you know, it's a decision you make as a business owner. But I agree with Jean-Francois. It is different when it's a parent-child relationship. So a little different situation for sure. Because quite often they're expecting mom to pay, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the other thing is that even if I, you know, to get clarity, like if we went back to the little role play, Mark, I would say, so, you know, what else? You know, I understand you want to go to the beach. You like to do some exploring. You like it to be warm. What about places in the world? Is there a place you would like to go to? Is there something you would dream about?
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Like, I like the Greek islands.
Ah. So the Greek islands would be on your list, you know, so then we can sort of get clarity around it. With kids, it's actually really good to be able to engage them in that kind of a conversation, because at least you get a better understanding of what they like and don't like and what they're looking for. And often through this, you know, this clarification and asking more questions and really sticking with it, you understand a lot more about the party and what they're interested in. Right?
True.
And this is what sets the stage for more options. I want to talk a little bit about teams, because in many cases you have a group of people that you're negotiating with. So how could you apply this in that scenario? You can basically follow the same process, but you need to take the time for everyone to go around the room and take turns. So, and it's good if you have a whiteboard or some way to share the points, but to go around the room and ask each person to give you one concern or comment about the solution that you're trying to find, and not to get into solutions. And then everyone takes turns, so everybody has a voice, and then you can repeat it until all the concerns are on the table before you drop into the brainstorming part. Okay, I realize I'm probably running out of time here, so I'm going to move on to the next slide. Thanks, Mark, for your participation there. The next part is just to brainstorm. So really just throw out as many ideas as you can, look at different options, to really try to think outside the box to find that really great win-win type solution, right? And the more ideas you bring, the better. One of the things about psychology is if there's the funny thing about it is if there's only a couple of options, we don't really think about it very deeply. We use what our fast thinking to make a judgment on it. When you get 3 or 4 decisions on the table or options on the table, people will have to slow down and really engage and think. So the more you can, the more ideas you can come up with, the more people are going to think about a great solution. And when I've done this in teams, it's really funny because often the person, you know, the CEO or whatever who has the most power figures they know what the solution is. And when we come out of the meeting, it's never what they thought. And they always agree it's way better than what they had. So there you go. One other key point, be careful of your language. If you can come from that sort of shared space of we or us or ours, as opposed to I, me, mine, myself, shifting your language to be inclusive of them as a joint partnership will help keep the communication open and inclusive. Then based on that, then you can select the best agreement. So that part's fairly easy. It's good to have some clarity around that. So it's to try and restate to make sure everyone agrees. The next part is really to finalize the commitment. So a couple things here. You know, take the time to write it down is usually a good idea. Make sure everyone knows what they're being asked for. Make sure that everyone has the skills and the resources that they need in order to make the commitment, because often we might feel, you know, like we have to make a commitment, but not really be able to fulfill it. Also to have a little discussion around how do you keep yourself accountable and what are you going to do when things fall apart? Because most agreements, any long-term agreement, there'll be issues that come up and your guys, and the two of you or whatever, through the partnership, you're going to have to resolve them. So being able to have some talk about that beforehand, so you know what kind of strategies you might use, what level of communication, when are you going to tell people that things are not going as smoothly as you hoped, or whatever, right? So these are good conversations to have once you have an agreement. And then the next part is to actually look at what you learned, right? So to take a little time with your partner and discuss, you know, what worked well, what could we do better next time, what did we learn as part of the process. This will help really build your relationship with this person. And if it's a negotiation for a new partnership, then this will help you maintain the partnership throughout the agreement. And finally, you can celebrate. Because, yay, you did it. And that's the end. Any questions, thoughts, comments?
Thank you. Let's open up the chat box, shall we? Because I saw somebody talking about compromise a little bit earlier. Let's, great. Thank you. Where's the chat box? There it is. How do we put it on the side? I don't know how to do that part.
You just click the chat button.
Pardon?
Just click the chat button and it should pop right up on the side.
I've got the chat box, but it's in the middle of my screen. Does everybody see that instead of on the side?
No.
Okay. Then I will go back.
One here I found.
Only you see it, Barbara.
Okay. Well,
there's one here from Gail.
Yeah, it's about compromise.
Yeah. I think sometimes compromise is the only option. However, it is not the best outcome. In compromise, everyone loses something. We can always try for a win-win. What are your recommendations if there is a great scarcity from one of the parties? I'm not quite sure what you mean by great. Gail, do you want to talk? Or are you?
Yeah, Gail's on the line.
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry, I had myself muted on my phone. But you know, sometimes like in a negotiation, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, like sometimes in a negotiation, if you have like somebody who's taking such a strong stance, there's no room to move, but it's like you're in a situation where you have to negotiate, but it's always at a loss, like to the other. You know, maybe if it feels a little bit like somebody's dominating. I think you talked about it actually in the beginning, like you can get to a point where people can be so stubborn about their stance and it feels like nowhere to move. Like what's somebody's next step if they're really in a win-lose situation with somebody who's a little bit bullyish or even, you know?
Right. The thing, there's a couple things that come up for me. One is with the bully to spend the time to really understand their position, and they might come back with some very aggressive statements with, you know, you do this and you do that, which is one of their tactics. To just say, yes, I understand you think I'm, you know, inconsiderate or whatever, and stay focused on what, you know, what is their position, and for them to get clear on that, that you're actually listening to it will help diffuse the situation. And also maybe to focus a little bit on, you know, this needs to be a win-win for both of us, or otherwise I'm not really willing to agree. This is where your BATNA comes in, because if you know, if they're going to be adamant about their position and they're not really interested in anything else, knowing what your alternative is, because you may not want to go into an agreement with them.
Mm-hmm.
Make some sense?
Sure. Thank you. This was useful, by the way. I enjoyed it.
I'm going to, Melissa, can you hear me? Melissa, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a question, because Melissa is a woman CEO running a construction firm. So I'm guessing, Melissa, that you work with a lot of men all the time.
Yeah, definitely.
And so I was interested in Victoria bringing up the, you know, the thing about sometimes women have to present themselves with a cause. I'm sure you've gone through a lot of, especially now where, you know, having to readjust your whole industry. Can you share one of your experiences dealing with all those males in your firm?
To be totally honest, the weirdest shift I saw in how I was treated on site was when I changed my last name. When I went from having the same last name as my dad, as the company, to my married name, I was all of a sudden perceived as having earned my position as opposed to being given it. And I know that's more of a like family shift than opposed to a female shift.
Yeah.
But it was night and day. It was totally bizarre. After that, I mean, I am very much a person that unless I know the answer to something, I tend to not speak it. So by taking classes that I knew these other builders had taken, I was able to speak with them on the same page. And ultimately, I mean, I'm not much of a pushover. I just spoke the way that I saw them speaking to each other. I mean, I know I do get treated a little bit more delicately than everybody else, but I haven't had too much of an issue with it. I think I'm just fairly upfront and direct. I speak to them in the same language that they speak.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's different with my crew than it is with other builders.
Explain that.
Several years ago, I took a DISC assessment, which is a personality profile for business. If someone's not familiar with it, I highly recommend it because it allowed me to kind of see the various personality types and pick up on the cues of what those personality types tend to present themselves as, and then shift my tone and my speaking and my negotiation to kind of work with their personality type.
Well, having said that, I'll do a plug for the BMO series. That is exactly what I will be covering on June the 2nd for the Power of Relationship Marketing. I'm actually doing the personal style indicator, which talks about the different personal styles of communicating and how to shift.
Yeah, it's very, very helpful because I definitely have people on my team that need direct, they need no BS. Yeah. And then I have those that I really need to handhold.
Yes, that's great advice. So you use different tools to help you in that negotiation. Great.
Yeah.
And I would like to just mention one thing that Victoria said that I used to use that I found very powerful. And that was the power of the pause, like just being quiet you know, once we'd come to some sort of agreement, I often needed signatures. So I would move the paper towards the, you know, the contract towards the person had to sign it and say, excuse me, all I need is your signature so we can move forward. And then shut up. And that's hard to do.
I think JF made a similar comment in the chat box. Well, it also gives you the time to think. So that pause is silence and pausing is very important. Great points. And Kim, you've come on since. Can you share who you are? Kim, are you still there? Hi, Kim, we can't see you. Kim, is your, oh, I don't know. It's always good to know who's on the line.
I do believe Kim is with the city of Abbotsford.
Okay. What about iDrum01 iPhone?
That's Lori Drummond.
Okay, great. And Kim, are you there? Are you in the, oh, she's on a city laptop. Great. So it's always good to know where people are coming from with respect to, Kim is not a member, but she is a member on the city council, city of Abbotsford. Great, wonderful, economic development. So Victoria, you did a wonderful presentation. Yeah, economic development. That's what I thought, Kim. Thank you. Thank you very much. And this session will be on, two things will happen. Alicia will be sending you out an evaluation. It's always great for us to know how you responded to the workshop and to the webinar. And then we also have it recorded so that if there are pieces that you need to go back to, Gail, I know that you said it was very valuable to you. And so sometimes it's like, what was that? What did that BATNA, what did BATNA stand for? And so you have to go back to a slide. And so it will be recorded. You will get the link. And great that you can connect. Victoria, did you give your information with respect to your email if they have questions that they need to answer to you?
It's on the, sorry, it's on the beginning of the presentation.
Okay, perfect, perfect.
Yeah.
So it's all there for you. By all means, connect with each other. And any last comments, Victoria, before we sign off?
Here's to successful negotiations.
Thank you. And I think that Alicia's already sent you the exercise that you sent to everyone. So yeah. By all means, go for it, ladies, and look forward to seeing you next week at another webinar. And Susie, I think you get the gold star for attending everyone.
Thanks. I was a little late joining. Sorry about that, but I caught most of it.
Good. Thank you. Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.